It needs me, just as much as I need it. The moment was destined, every choice bringing me closer to this one line. This line. This last line.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, good whatever time you're listening to this podcast. My name is James Albarn and you're listening to The Last Line. Thank you very much for joining me, and sincere apologies for the delay in getting you this episode 10. A whole heap of technical issues has plagued this week's episode, but finally it is here for your aural delight. And this week you will be hearing my interview with none other than criminal defense lawyer and star of Making a Murderer, Jerry Buting. Jerry, of course, was the part of the defense team for Stephen Avery, who was the subject of the Netflix documentary series Making a Murderer. Series 2 of that just started on Friday. I spoke to Jerry about a month ago now, as he'd written a book called Illusion of Justice. We talk about the problems with the American criminal justice system, sort of briefly touching on Making a Murderer. We also talk about why Jerry thinks that filming trials is a good idea and why the Brits maybe should adopt that practice. We also talk about his faith and his battle with cancer. But first I wanted to get Jerry's opinion on why it seems that more people are drawn to being a prosecutor as opposed to a defense lawyer. I guess a good place to start is, and I know you probably get asked this a lot, and I always try and sort of avoid asking asking people on my podcast stuff they've been asked hundreds of times, but sometimes I guess it's slightly unavoidable.
Sure.
I just about you choosing criminal defense as the path you wanted to go down in law. And I've heard you say a lot about you like championing the underdogs. And I wondered where that sense came from, and why more people aren't drawn to that as opposed to the other side.
Why people more are not drawn to it, or are?
Yeah, because it seems to me like, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I've got like the complete wrong end of the stick on it, but it seems to me that people aren't as drawn to being a defense lawyer as they are being on the side of the prosecution. And I sort of wondered why you think that is.
Sure. I think people are drawn more towards the prosecution than the defense because of the way that the defense is portrayed, and the way the prosecution and law enforcement are portrayed in the media and television, movies. It's usually, the cops and the prosecutors are the good guys. They're the ones who are getting the bad guys, and defense attorneys are portrayed as just sort of, getting people off who are guilty, when that's not the case. And both in your country and in mine, it's the whole adversary system of the criminal justice system is based on there being, hopefully equal advocates on both sides that will, present their perspective on their case to the fact finder, whether it's a judge or a jury, and then the truth will be discerned from hearing both sides. And so, for me, I don't know whether it's because I was, kind of a, sort of a awkward, gangly, unathletic kid growing up who didn't excel in a lot of the things that made kids popular, that somehow I identified with the underdog, perhaps. I still grew up in a middle-class family that was privileged in many ways. We were not wealthy, but we were certainly not poor, destitute. So I recognized I had a lot of privileges. One of being my skin color in America was a big privilege. But still, I could understand those who didn't have the privileges that I didn't have the advantages, and did struggle, day in and day out. And so I think I gravitated more towards them than I did for the prosecution. Now, I did work for a prosecutor's office once, a very short period of time, as a law student. And I found that I was, wasn't a lawyer at the time. I was supporting prosecutors with like legal memos about whether or not this police search or stop and arrest of a person was constitutionally proper. And I would read the defense renditions of the facts. I would sit in the court, listen to the testimony, and I kept writing these reports saying, "This is a bad search. You should dismiss this case." And they had to keep reminding me I worked for the prosecutor, not the defense, because it was just my perspective on the way things were proceeding in court, is that the defense, even when they had good facts and law on their side, still somehow ended up losing these motions. So I also began to practice law in the early 80s. And so there was still a lot of prosecution of minor offenses and things. I always had a problem being a prosecutor trying to send somebody to jail for something that I had done myself at some point in my youth.
Right.
And as a assistant prosecutor, you really had no power or discretion not to prosecute those kinds of cases. So I just made a decision pretty early on that the prosecution wasn't for me.
It's interesting that you say that you think a lot of it's to do with the portrayal of prosecution teams, and in a way, I was expecting sort of a more complicated answer in a way, but I guess it makes sense. Like when you boil it down to something that simple, it sort of makes sense that actually, all the people you see on TV, like cop shows, that it's rarely like a cop drama about a public defender who's like getting people off cases. That's interesting. So like I said, I was expecting more of a sort of grand, answer, I guess, but it makes sense.
Well, I could give a more grand answer, but when it really comes down to it, I think that a lot of it, in terms of why young people would choose to, go into law enforcement or prosecution versus the defense, I think that's a big part of it. Now, I think that has changed somewhat after Making a Murderer, and I've been surprised at how many people think that have heaped adulation and praise on my colleague Dean Strang and I for our representation of our client against the government, as if we were somehow unique, and they were surprised that we were able to do it with integrity, and that it sort of renewed their faith in the defense function. They understood the defense function a little better. And I think that's, again, it's because in popular culture, the law enforcement and police have sort of had a de facto monopoly on what supposedly is the truth, when it's not the truth. It never has been the truth. But this is one of the first times people really got to see it in action, in a real case.
Yeah, like Making a Murderer I was a classic case. I just like watched it all, like binge watched it for like in a couple of days because it was just like so like thrilling in a way, like the way it was made and stuff. And there's one episode that's always stood out to me. It's where you find the vial. It's like a cliffhanger at the end of the episode. You find the vial,
right?
And I think you call up Dean.
Yeah.
Here's who you call, and you're like, we've got him, or it's like game on or something like that.
On,
and
yeah.
it's, in a way, in that instance, you became that TV like cop, not cop. You became the hero of a TV show in that instance, because just the way it was made and the way it was filmed and that cliffhanger and your game on line, it was like it was a written show. It was sort of amazing, really. You don't often see that in documentary.
No, but it's funny because that shows you I know nothing about making films or documentaries, because I'd forgotten that they were even filming that at that time. I was sort of absorbed in my phone call and the discovery and talking to Dean and explaining it all.
Yeah.
And when I hung up, I thought, oh, you're not going to use this, are you? I mean, I felt like I was overly giddy, and when I watch it, I still think I look like a dork, but people love it, and they thought, oh no, this is a very, we're keeping that as a good scene. But it just shows I had no editorial control because I wouldn't have put it in.
Going back to criminal defense, you were public defender for 9 years, and there's a story you tell in sort of every interview that I've listened to you about your book, and you tell it in the book about you judging a client that comes to you,
making a snap judgment. Correct.
Yeah, when actually he was telling the truth the whole time.
Right.
I guess the question is it hard? It obviously in that situation, it's kind of understandable how you reach that, when you're overworked as a public defender. But even now, when you're not a public defender, is it still hard to stop yourself from doing that sort of thing just as a human being? Sort of, is it hard to not go, I've got a hunch about this guy and I'm just,
Mm-hmm. Sometimes, because I think it's human nature to, what's the old phrase, don't judge a book by its cover. And yet there's also a maxim about people's first impressions of people often being correct. So that's sort of in conflict. But you do the very first time you meet a client now, or as then when I was a public defender, you kind of size them up, make some snap judgments. But as a professional, I've also learned that I kind of check those at the door. And now when I meet somebody and maybe I hear the prosecution's version first, which of course is usually what you have with a criminal complaint or an indictment, it's very one-sided. It's presented only from the prosecution's viewpoint and usually leaves out anything that helps the defense. So you read that over, you're meeting with a client, and I've learned, though, to sort of check my opinion at the door and to listen to the person as a human being and hear what they have to say. But you do still find yourself looking at them, listening to them, and imagining, well, how are other people going to react when they hear this person explain? Are they going to be looking at his body language or her body language, or I could tell he looked guilty by his eyes. I mean, you hear those kinds of things, and you have to be thinking ahead. And so I make those kinds of assessments early on in my meetings with people, rather than judging so much the content of, are they telling the truth or not? Are they innocent or are they guilty? Because it's very often further investigation that comes through that's necessary to answer that question.
Yeah. That's interesting how you say about how they present to other people. I guess that's a really important part of
it is
what you do, I guess.
It is. And, most times prosecution witnesses, there's a lot of police officers, and they're really professional witnesses. They're taught how to testify. They testify frequently. You'll see even in Making a Murderer, all of the prosecution's witnesses were taught to sort of pivot in their chair and answer my questions while looking at the jury, not me. Which is just a sort of a more of a professional technique. It's like I wanted to say, no, look at me. I'm asking the question. Don't look at them. But most of the time, my clients are not professional witnesses. They've never testified in court before, and they're nervous. Some of them are uneducated, inarticulate, and people make snap judgments, like I said, with first impressions. You have to also be careful, even before your client ever testifies, if that happens in a case. That the jury is watching the defendant throughout the trial, how he or she react to various testimony. You often hear, and part of this is the media, when they report some part of a trial, they'll say that the defendant showed no emotion when this such and such was said, as if somehow that shows that they're cold, rather than trying to simply be dignified and respectful of the courtroom.
Yeah.
So these are all things you have to think about.
Yeah. You talk about the media, and over here, they don't film trials. They don't allow cameras into the courtroom. Right. And on the news, you get these sort of like weird, it feels really antiquated. You get the weird sort of like sketches drawn by the courtroom artists. What's your opinion on that? It just sort of came to mind when you were saying about how, because I often wonder whether it's a good or a bad thing that we're not allowed to film trials here, and whether that affects the way media portray defendants, etc. I wondered what your take on that was, I guess.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent in favor of cameras in the courtroom. Not every state in America has that, and none of the federal courts allow cameras in the courtrooms. But, we've had it in Wisconsin for over 30 years. The objections to it initially were twofold. One, oh my God, lawyers are going to grandstand for the cameras. They're going to play to the cameras. And I don't think that has proven to be true at all. Maybe in a few rare cases, but by and large, you're in trial. It's a very intensive, focused thing. You are focusing on your 12 people in the jury as your audience, not some cameras. Now, and also when it first started, there was concern about there being, be disruptive. And it's true. They used to have big banks of, television cameras on tripods. But nowadays, there are these little hidden cameras in the ceiling. and they're not disruptive at all. Nobody sees them.
Yeah.
The one area where maybe there is some credence is the concern that maybe witnesses might maybe tailor their testimony a little differently if they know they're getting their like 15 minutes of fame. And one example in Making a Murder was the DNA expert for the state, Sherry Colhane with the big hair. I mean, she didn't come to work every day looking like that. At least I don't think so. So there is some of that, but I think that shakes out during the trial with the questioning from the various attorneys. Where I really think it's important to have cameras in the courtroom is because it gives citizens the opportunity to see what's going on in their courtrooms. And that's one thing I think that made Making a Murder so popular, was that people got to actually see what witnesses said, how they looked when they said it. And by and large, most didn't like what they saw happening in that courtroom in Stephen Avery's case or Brendan Dassey's case. And I think we need that kind of feedback, that opportunity in a democracy for people to really see how a very important part of their justice system, the big institution, performs. In America, we have elective offices, many of them judges, not every state, but about half. Every state, prosecutors, sheriffs. And, if people are going to vote for those people, they should know a little bit more about what they do and whether they like what they do. And what better way than to see what goes on in the courtroom. And then the last thing is it's unfiltered, by and large. I mean, you still, if all you watch is the evening news recap, you're going to see just little snippets. But if it's streamed online, and if it's a big enough case, people can actually watch all of the testimony without any filtering. An example is in America, the Paul Manafort trial that just happened in federal court. Nobody really got to see what was going on there. It was all filtered by the media, and, as our president would say, the fake media too. Putting their spin on it. So when you actually have cameras in the courtroom, the citizens can see for themselves.
Also, I guess it gives a way, not only to see how the justice system is performing, like you said, but also just it's a good education for people. Some people could go through their lives, if they'll never see what a trial is like, I guess, because over here we can't, because unless you go and watch yourself, you can't, see it on the on the news or whatever. So I guess it's a good education. So
it is.
There's a sentence you say at the end of your book, it's in your closing statements chapter, where you say the defense lawyer's job is to make the human case as much or as more than the legal case in court. And I don't quite know what the question is, which is something I often find myself saying on these podcasts. But I found that to be a really interesting line, and I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, what I mean, and I think it's become even more important, these days where the volume of cases in court is so high, particularly in America. I mean, the number of new laws of things that become a crime compared to what there were, 20 years ago. So much behavior now is not just an accident. If something goes wrong, it's made into a crime, and that's contributed to clogging the courts, putting a lot of pressure on the courts to process cases without them increasing the funding so much, so that it's not that many more judges, that many more prosecutors or public defenders. And so in order to be efficient, quote unquote, courts really try and jam cases through in as quickly or as quick a time as possible, with as little time spent on the defendant as they can get away with. And so I think oftentimes it's the defense role to sort of slow things down, get the judge to see the defendant as a human being, and to understand more about that human being than whatever happened on that day or night when this charge arose. Because for the vast majority of defendants, that's just a snapshot that doesn't indicate everything about their life or character, or the likelihood that they can be rehabilitated and will never come back. And so that's what I mean about trying to bring humanity. It's not just a question of guilt or innocence in many cases. The majority of people that come to me aren't professing their innocence, but they might admit what they did, but not necessarily what they're charged with. Sometimes the prosecution will charge something that doesn't fit, that's more serious. Maybe it's a negotiating leverage, and yes, I did this, but not that. Okay, so why did this happen? Drugs, alcohol, they're a big factor that fuel behavior that becomes criminal and on a particular night. But look at everything else about this person, Judge. This might be their first arrest of any kind. They're gainfully employed, supporting their family, whatever, or they had been until, let's say, the last couple years or something, when they sort of entered a downward spiral fueled by drugs. And so what's the best way to address this conduct? Is it locking them up for a number of years, having them come back to society and fall back into the same cycle? Or is it treating the root cause of why they're before you? So that's what a defense attorney has to do oftentimes.
And do you find that the justice system, I think I know the answer, but do you find that the justice system is receptive to that kind of humanity, or is it more concerned with just getting the people into the prisons, etc.?
It has not been particularly receptive. I think that's starting to change a little bit. Some judges kind of have a reputation of being, the quote unquote hanging judge, who maybe those pleas fall on deaf ears. But a lot of, we've had decades now in America to see that our very punitive approach to offenders doesn't work. And so judges, I think, are also looking for other ways that they can do justice and also reduce the chance that somebody is going to come back. And so rehabilitation is still a hard argument because it's often portrayed as being soft on crime. And particularly when judges are elected, if a case is a serious case with some publicity, they're going to be worried that an opponent will run against them and say, oh, you were soft on this sex offender or this drug offender. And so as much as they're not supposed to put politics into it, they're human beings too, and it's hard for them to completely separate that, which is why I don't think electing judges is a good idea. But I also think, society as a whole in America is starting to get a little wiser about our punitive justice system, this mass incarceration, where America has 5% of the world's population, but 20% of the world's incarcerated. It's just an enormous disparity. And people even in deep red southern states, Texas, for instance, as red a state as you can find, has been leading the way in reducing mass incarceration. They have reduced their prison population consistently for the last 5 years. A lot of other states are doing the same and realizing that they can be just as safe, if not safer, by looking for alternatives to just handing out, years in prison like it's candy on Halloween.
And what do you think's made that shift start to happen?
Part of it, I think, is purely economic.
Because it costs a lot to keep someone in prison.
It costs a lot to keep someone in prison. And just to give you an example, in Wisconsin, my state, for the last 5 years or more, we have been spending more on corrections, than all of the University of Wisconsin campuses combined, all over the state. Over $1 billion.
Blimey.
And people are saying, what's wrong with this picture here? Are we more safe than we used to be because we're locking people up so much? Is this a good use of taxpayers' money? And it hasn't really gotten through to the legislators in this state yet because they're controlled by a pretty right-wing faction, quite frankly. But that may be changing in November too. I use this example frequently because Minnesota, our neighboring state, similar demographics. When I first moved to Wisconsin in the early 80s, they had about 5,000 prison inmates. Wisconsin had about 7. Now Wisconsin has 24,000, and they have about 7. So, if you ask people in Minnesota, do you feel less safe than you are in Wisconsin with all that? No. So I think part of it is economic. The taxpayers realize it's expensive and it hasn't worked. The war on drugs has been a failure. So we need to look at other ways to try and change people's behavior. Portugal, for instance, has embarked on a very interesting experiment of legalizing drugs. And, it's still relatively recent, so it'll take some more time to see how things really shake out. But it seems to be working. There are fewer addicts. There are, where you might think there would be more drug use, there's not. Crime is down. There's a lot of experiments going around the world. Norway often gets criticized in America as being this sort of namby-pamby prison system where the prisoners' cells are more like college dorm rooms, and they're soft on crime. And on the other hand, their recidivism rate is so much better than America's. And you talk to their corrections people, and they say, look, we realize most of these people are going to return to society. So from day one, we start trying to work towards their rehabilitation so that they won't return to those criminal patterns. And it's just taken a long time for Americans to start thinking that way. And we have a long way to go. But yeah, I do think there's a trend that way, at least still at the state level. Once Trump was elected and Sessions was appointed as Attorney General, it's really slowed down reform on the federal level. But 90% of the criminal prosecutions in America are at the state level. So, there are still little opportunities for reform.
And you've got is it an election coming up in Wisconsin? Or
we have what they call midterms all over the country in November. So
yeah,
both at the state and federal level. So a lot of the governors, not every state has governors elected the very same cycle, but this year we do in Wisconsin. We have a governor, all of the legislature, as well as federal, both congressional and one of their Senate seats are up for election. And our governor, who has been, very hostile to any criminal justice reform, is in a dead heat right now, and it's hard to, we'll see how it shakes out, but he could very well lose.
And is he the one that is set on not releasing Steve? Because I've seen a lot of things about people calling now because the midterm's coming up, people calling for Stephen Avery to get released or Brendan Dassey to get released, and
yeah, he is the first governor in our 170-year history to not only not parole anybody from a sentence. Pardon anybody from a sentence. He has not even filled a board of pardon advisors. So state governors, as well as the President of the United States, have a constitutional pardon power. And they don't have to exercise it, but what they usually do is there's a board of advisors that accepts applications, reviews the facts, talk to the victim's family. Often they may have changed their mind and think, okay, this guy's done enough time. Let's either pardon him or do an early release called executive clemency. And our governor has said from the beginning he refuses to even consider anybody for pardon or clemency. So and in America, the president has no power to pardon somebody convicted of a state level offense.
right.
And so even though a lot of people are asking Obama to pardon Brendan Dassey and Stephen Avery at the time, he couldn't do it.
You said about there's some judges that have the reputation of being like a hanging judge. If you know that going in, if you walk in and it's that judge, or I'm guessing you know the judges in advance,
Yes.
right? So if you know that judge has got that reputation going in, does that alter your approach?
Yes.
Of how you deal with it?
Absolutely. Being a judge is a very multifaceted job. You have to deal with legal issues, some of which can be very complex. You have to sort of manage a jury trial, and you have to be sentencing a defendant if they're convicted. So not every judge is particularly good at all of those. Some people are good, fair sentencers who are willing to listen to both sides, an act of Solomon almost. Some are, maybe those judges are not very good on legal issues. Other judges maybe are good on legal issues and really bad at trial. They're constantly interfering. They don't let there be any flow from the parties to try and present the case, interfering, and they give a bad trial, so to speak. In the UK, it's always amazed me, particularly England, how involved your judges are at trial, interrupting and really exposing, showing their bias,
Right.
even to the point where they do a summing up, in which they will sum up the prosecution's case, and sometimes in a very slanted, way, either in favor of one side or the other. Whereas in America, the judges are supposed to be more like referees in a contest. They're supposed to be independent, but some judges aren't as good at doing that. So you do know going in, depending on what kind of judge you have, how best to shape your presentation so it's going to be as effective as possible on behalf of your client. So if it's a legal, very complex case, I'll make extra effort to make sure that my arguments are in writing with references to cases that they need to read in advance, so that give them time to really think about the legal issues and not have to make them on the fly. If it's a sentencing kind of a case, then it's again, getting your argument to them in advance, and then trying to let them know, I want to have 2 or 3 people speak. And so the judge knows, and he's not completely made up his or her mind before you ever walk into court.
In your book, you talk about how about your faith.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty strongly on the atheist side of things, but I found it really interesting when you talked about your faith and how it helps you in your work, and and you wrote something about how that you have often found that people with faith are better in a crisis, or I think that was the phrase. I can't remember the exact wording, but it was something to that effect, which I found really interesting, and I sort of wondered if you could
Sure.
tell me about that, I guess.
Sure, and I talk about this in the book. I was born in a pretty devout Catholic family, practicing, but then I left the church for 10 years or so on my own. Became much more questioning of what I was taught, but I kind of realized that my understanding was at a child's level, rather than continuing to grow and understand the church as well as my faith. And so I do think that, when you talk about somebody who's looking at life in prison without parole, it's very difficult sometimes for them to deal with the stress of a situation of the upcoming trial, or if they can convicted, to then be able to make something of life. It's like, my life is over. I'm going to be locked up for the rest of my life. I'll never be free. Mm-hmm. The lights will always turn off at the same time every night. I will be eating and showering and waking up, and all the little things that are completely regimented, with no freedom to do so many things. How can life be worth living at that point? And so I've found, though, that people that have some sort of faith life, whatever religion, it gives me a sense of humility, but can also give them a sense of peace and ability to accept what may be coming and what is happening as the case is proceeding to and during trial. It's much more easy, I think, to fall into despair if you have no sense of maybe that life has a bigger purpose, or and that's just my perspective from how I've dealt with other clients. When I see how, I'm amazed sometimes how people can soldier on, their families, dealing with the loss of their loved one potentially for life. Visitation in prison is better than nothing, but it's not the same, of course.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just easier, I think, when people have. It's twofold. Number one, it's their own personal faith, but also the community that they might belong to. I found that having a community of family and friends who can help support you, and often through your church or a synagogue or whatever, can strengthen your ability to accept what's coming.
It's interesting because as someone who doesn't go to church, I guess until you say about the community of the church and you sort of, you don't realize that,
Right.
you sort of, as someone who doesn't have faith, you don't really have that place to go,
Right.
For a community sense, and just, I've always thought that, as someone who doesn't believe in God, that the religious aspect of a church doesn't do anything for me. But often if I'm in a church or a cathedral or something like that, I'm often struck by how sort of lovely buildings they are, and how they're often lovely places to go.
Comforting.
Regardless of, I think it's to do with the sort of general respect that people give when they go into those sorts of buildings. That they're often quiet, and there's just a sense of calmness and peace in those sort of buildings that you don't really get anywhere else, really.
Right.
And yeah, I guess as someone who doesn't believe in God or have a faith, you sort of miss out on that a little bit. And I just thought it was interesting when you said that in the book.
Yeah, and when, as we all at some point in our lives will face a crisis, it's good to have support. And it doesn't have to be, a church or faith community.
Yeah.
You can find
Sure.
support elsewhere, but I find that they're better organized for that. So I talk about this in my book, a very, very serious cancer. And I was off work for an entire year. We had 2 little children. My wife was working, and it was a real struggle. But people in my church really rose to the occasion. They made meals that would come over every night or every couple of nights, which not only helped save my wife from cooking, but also the shopping to get the food to do that. And little things like that all of these stay-home moms who volunteered to drive me to my doctor's appointments, to my physical therapy, so that my wife could work or take care of the kids, in one way or the other. So they were organized to be able to do that, not just for me, but they have done that with other people, with other periods of crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a big comfort for me. And I sometimes wonder how people who don't have that kind of support community can get through a real crisis, particularly a very serious battle with cancer, for instance.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about your illness, because my mum had cancer, I think, over 5 years ago now. And she's all great now. But yeah, like you were saying then, and there are a lot of sort of, we have like Macmillan over here that are a cancer charity that offer support and stuff, but we really didn't do any of that. And I think part of it was my mum didn't want to do any of that because I don't know the reasons. Maybe partly because she didn't want to accept that she was ill, or whatever it was. But my dad ended up, sort of shouldering it all. I was still at school at the time, so he'd have to take me to school. He took my mum to every appointment, and he had to sort of carry it all. And we had very supportive friends who, would do things. But yeah, it's interesting. You talk about that, about how, how do you cope? And I guess at that point, I don't know. I don't know what point I'm trying to make there, but I was going to ask you, because you say about how you felt perfectly fine and fit and that's very similar to my mum, and that's she really struggled to accept her illness because she was going to the gym a lot. She was really fit and healthy. Well, she thought she was fit and healthy.
Right.
And then suddenly it's just dropped on you. She woke up with back pain one night, and then it was discovered she had lymphoma, and that was,
Right.
So I wanted to ask you a bit about that, because that's kind of, how did you cope with that?
It's, for me, it's different for everybody, of course. For me, I had no signs. I wasn't ill. I just had a small lump, no bigger than like my, the knuckle of my thumb. And I thought it was probably a cyst or something in my thigh, but who gets cancer in your leg? I've never
it's kind of
never
odd.
even heard
it's
of
kind
it,
of odd, yeah.
But it turns out cancer is everywhere. You can get cancer in any type of cell in your body, and so it was a big shock, and I think every cancer patient or survivor goes through this period of shock when you first hear the word. This is malignant. This is cancer. Thankfully, there are many cancer survivors these days, and some cancers we've able to manage almost as just chronic illnesses, even if they're not completely cured. For me now, it's been almost 17 years since I was first diagnosed, and it's amazing because it was a particularly lethal and fairly rare kind of cancer. If you ever get a cancer, you don't want it to be a rare one, because there's not a lot of research on it. There's not a lot of treatment options, but your mom the same way. If she's made it to 5 years, that's great. It's not necessarily the death sentence that it used to be when people are diagnosed with cancer. It varies widely depending on the type of cancer, and I don't know. People often talk about it as if it's a battle, a war. You fight cancer, and if you somehow fight harder, you can survive, and if you don't, you won't. And that's clearly not true. We don't know exactly why some people survive and some people don't for the very same kind of cancers. But I think there is some evidence that trying to keep a positive attitude can help. And whether it's, mind, body, interrelationship. We don't know at this point, but there's some evidence of that. So I try always being encouraging for people to keep them positive, even though sometimes it's very difficult to do that. I describe it in my book, really not to try and get sympathy or anything, but it was because my illness had a big part in whether or not I would decide to take on Stephen Avery's case. I was not yet out of the woods. And this was going to be a very all-consuming kind of a job to take on a case like this. And if I got sick again, what would we do? So all of that had to be considered. And that's why I talk about it in the book.
But in a way, I guess, that probably helped you. I'm assuming, come out of it because you were focusing so much on something.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you almost didn't have time to sort of start worrying about whether your illness is going to come back or something like that.
That's true.
You just, I guess, in a way, throwing yourself into something is kind of a...
That's true. And I had done one big serious case even before that, after my recovery from cancer. So I knew I could do it. It was more the concern. I was still doing scans every 3 months. I think I just stretched out to once every 6 months. And you talk to anybody who goes through that cycle, as soon as you get an all clear, it's like, whew, I got a reprieve. Another 6 months, But then as you get closer to the next cycle of scans, you start getting nervous, even when you don't realize it. That
was certainly the case for my mom.
It is.
Yeah.
And it is true, I suppose, being totally immersed and focused on something else can help delay that sort of nervousness about the upcoming scans.
Yeah. You had the thing I find really extraordinary about your story, about your illness, is the fact that you were diagnosed on 9/11.
Yeah.
And that's a crazy story. I just wondered if you don't... I know you've probably told it hundreds of times, but I wonder if you don't mind just telling that story.
Sure. It was pretty hard to believe looking back on it. But I had only about 2 weeks before that is when I went to see a doctor about this little lump that turned out to be the tip of an iceberg. It was a tumor the size of my hand, all kind of interwoven through my muscles. But so I had a scan, and this guy says, there's something in there, but it might not be malignant. You need to go see a specialist. And so I went to see an orthopedic oncology specialist, surgeon, and he took one look at it and said, this is, we'll have to do a biopsy to be sure, but this is clearly malignant. I've seen this before. I can tell you which one of two types, and you might lose your leg. We used to do amputations regularly in these cases, but it's lethal. We'll try and save your life. We'll try and save your leg. And he's sort of dropping all this on us when he gets paged. And he's like, well, I'll let you guys, my wife and I, talk about this for a few minutes. I'll be back. And so we're just stunned. We'd hoped that maybe the specialist would say, this could be benign. And instead, he'd given us our worst nightmare. And then he came back in a few minutes later and said that was my wife who paged me. And she said that a plane has just hit the World Trade Center. And one of the towers has collapsed. And we were like, what? This guy's crazy. We were just at the windows on the world at the very top of the World Trade Center, maybe less than a year ago. And so, of course, he wasn't nuts, but the rest that day will forever be in my memory is not just this terrible national, really international tragedy, but this my own personal crisis that was going on as well. And I would hear all the news. The president's plane is missing, and all the flights have been grounded, and is there still an ongoing terrorist attack going everywhere? And yet I kept thinking, well, I could be dead in a few months. As sympathetic as I am about what's going on, I also sort of looked and I said, wow, what's my life been worth? I could be gone, and I've just been this little blip, had no influence on the world, seemingly. So it was a very sobering day for me in many ways.
I always ask, I think every podcast I've done, this is the 10th I've done. I think every podcast I've done, I've asked people the same question about whether they like being interviewed. And usually the people I've talked to have been musicians or radio presenters or journalists. So they're used to getting interviewed. You've been sort of thrust into the whole thing by virtue of a documentary, and so I wanted to ask you the same question, because I think it's slightly more of a complicated one for you. I guess.
Well, I had done other high profile cases before the Stephen Avery, and certainly while that case was going on, I was interviewed some, although I was limited what I could say under the rules. But so I was not unfamiliar with dealing with media or interviews, but totally unprepared for the kind of explosion of interest that happened after Making a Murder. I mean, it was incredible that I couldn't walk down the street of New York and get less than a block without people coming up to me, calling me out by name. Jerry, I got to get a selfie. My girlfriend won't believe I ran into you. Those kinds of things. And everybody very nice, not intrusive, but it was a quick sort of shocking being thrust into the limelight like this. But at first it was kind of awkward. Why me? Dean and I felt the same way. We were just representative of many other very, very good and probably more deserving criminal defense attorneys. But after a while, we realized, we're the ones that the microphone is being thrust towards, and that we need to take the opportunity to try and change people's perspectives on the role of a criminal defense attorney, the importance of the defense function in a criminal justice system. And as long as people were willing to listen, we were willing to talk about that. One of the things I think that's been the most rewarding from this whole experience is the number of young people who've reached out to me on Twitter or Facebook or emails saying, I'm so interested in the law now. I'm thinking I'm going to go to law school, or I want to be a criminal defense attorney too. And that's really really rewarding to me. If I can help inspire young people to enter this, what I think is a very noble and honorable career, then I could die a happy man.
Well, there was a lot of excited people at work yesterday when I said, we were asking, because usually when people ask me what I'm doing with my weekend, I don't really do much at the weekend. So it's kind of like, yeah, not much. But I said, I'm interviewing Jerry Buting from Making a Murderer tomorrow. And everyone was like, what? So they were very excited. I was going to ask you about the case of Ralph Armstrong, because that kind of runs concurrently through the book, along with the Stephen Avery trial.
Sure.
And there's just like a really extraordinary bit of that. I mean, the whole case is kind of extraordinary, but there's a bit. Is it Ricky or Richie Arabia?
Yeah.
Who's the witness? And they interview her or him now, I guess, under hypnosis.
Right.
And then stage some weird, like,
reenactment.
Identification. Yeah. That was extraordinary. That was just like blew my mind. So I wanted to ask you about that, really.
Sure. So the Ralph Armstrong case is a very interesting one, and it's in the book. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote the book was not just to talk about Making a Murderer, Stephen Avery, and Dassey's cases, but because what a lot of people saw in the documentary was all too commonplace, or at least not rare, in my career. And the Ralph Armstrong case was a perfect example of the intrigue and the prosecutorial misconduct is shocking. And we don't have time to get into it in detail. Hopefully people will read the book. But in short, it's a man who spent 29 years wrongly convicted in prison for a rape and a murder. And 15 of those years, I was representing him, fighting for him. And even after we got DNA exclusions from piece of evidences, after one after another, crime scene evidence, the state kept changing their theory, where it was at trial these two head hairs found on a bathrobe belt draped across the deceased body, which clearly had been placed there by the killer. And at trial, it's like they did this voodoo science of hair comparison and said, those are Ralph Armstrong's hairs on that belt. And once we proved they weren't, somehow, it didn't matter. They didn't come from the killer. And time and time again, these were the arguments that were made. It was a very circumstantial, shaky case to begin with. And so a young woman is murdered in her home, a co-ed, just off the campus of the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And there was one witness at a neighboring apartment building who had seen a person going in and out of her building, gave a description, but before the police ever did any kind of eyewitness procedure, like a lineup or a photo array or anything like that, they decided to hypnotize this person.
Is that common, or that can't be right?
It's this case was an old case, so it was 1980, and back in that day, there was a belief that hypnosis would help unlock memories that people couldn't really experience in their conscience, but they would be there. And nowadays, it's not done very often. It's not unheard of, but it's not done very often because.
So you can still do it.
You can, but there are so in fact, Ralph's case, when his case went up on appeal, sort of laid some groundwork in Wisconsin about what kind of safeguards they had to employ. Because one of the other problems with hypnosis is it puts people in a very suggestive state, and they can be very easily led into, and in fact, memories planted in their conscious mind that were never there before.
Yeah.
And then it's very difficult to cross-examine them at trial because you can't really confront your accuser anymore. They've been altered. It's altered evidence. And so it's in Ralph's case, the Supreme Court imposed this whole set of guidelines that had to be followed from henceforth and thereafter, but didn't apply them to Ralph's case. It didn't help him. So he continued to languish in prison until DNA evidence came around and started to exonerate him.
Mm-hmm.
So that was strange, though. The witness said, in fact, recanted her recantation, or her testimony, and then recanted the recantation at trial. But before the trial, she said, the police were pressuring me to make this identification. I knew the lineup was rigged. There were cops wearing wigs, which is, it's true. I've got the photograph. I wanted to put it in the book, but we didn't.
It's almost comical in a way. It's not funny because it
is.
It kind of is comical. It's
when people look at it,
it's unbelievable.
When they look at this photograph nowadays, they laugh and say, come on, they didn't really use this. Nobody would buy this. This was so obvious. It's like in 1980, somehow my client had long hair, shoulder length. It's like somehow they couldn't find other long hair, shoulder length people. So come on. So they used cops who had very short hair, militaristic almost style. And then they put wigs, cheap wigs. And this new wigs. One of them, they would just pass back and forth and weren't even straight. It wasn't even straight on the cop's head. But police got away with that stuff back then. And that was only the beginning of many bending of the rules that they did in Ralph Armstrong's case before we finally were able to get him out. And so later, if you read the book and so you understand what happened, it's pretty shocking that what was going on, that was hidden from us, the defense, while the Stephen Avery trial was going on. I got a tip from somebody that saw me online and said, hey, I have information on this other case you've got. And we investigated it, and it blew the case wide open with a really shocking revelation. So
So go read the book.
It's a good story.
Listening.
It's a good story.
It's a good book as well. I really enjoyed it. So there you have it, Jerry Buting and episode 10 of The Last Line. And with episode 10 ending, as does our first run of podcasts, series 1, if you will, has been completed. We're going to take a little break over the next couple of months, and we'll be back shortly after Christmas and in the new year with 10 more brilliant and interesting guests for you to listen to. And if you have just joined us today, then there's 9 other episodes that you can go and listen to with an array of delightful people. And if you've listened to all 10, then thank you very much. Please do subscribe to the podcast, leave us a review if you enjoyed the show. It really does help us. And if you want to be extra generous, then you can head over to patreon.com/thelastline, where you can chuck us some of your money and be adequately rewarded for doing so. Also, follow us on Instagram at The Last Line Podcast, where you'll get updates about the show and see who I'm recording new shows with, sneak peeks, etc. Maybe some bonus clips that didn't make the original shows. There's all sorts of treats for you to go and discover. So please do. So that's it. Series 1 over. Thank you very much for joining me. And I will see you all again in the new year. Until next time, my name is James Albon, and this is The Last Line.